A calorie is not just a calorie to the brain. The brain responds differently to different macronutrients. And this is a huge area of research in the world of just obesity and just BMI and everything. Trying to understand, wait a minute, like we've looked a lot at the metabolism. We need to be looking at the brain. And it's now that we start to discover that, well, maybe it's not all just about one calorie being the same as another calorie, because how the brain sees things is entirely different. Okay, we need to look at the very big picture here. And this has now been confirmed by really cool functional MRI to understand what kind of diet is really not good. And a lot of it comes down to our dopamine, but a lot of it is still a big mystery because we don't want to rely just on dopamine as the neurotransmitter responsible for our pleasure-seeking behavior when it comes to food. Food is much more deeply rooted than just pleasure. It's also survival-oriented. It's also biologically needed. So to say that it's only going to activate dopamine is a little bit short-sighted. But anyhow, let's break it down a little bit more. I put a link down below for 30% off of Seed's Daily Symbiotic. I don't really recommend probiotics very often, but Seed has a very, very interesting one, and that's a 30% off discount link. So they have a capsule inside of a capsule. So it has a prebiotic and a probiotic in one. So if you're trying to really make a dent in your gut microbiome and make a serious change, that's probably the only probiotic I would ever recommend. So again, that link down below will get your hands on that for a 30% off discount, and then you can try taking it every day. So because it's a symbiotic, that means that it has like a multi-stage delivery system. So it has a prebiotic that breaks down, which is going to help feed the gut bacteria and help feed the probiotic, which breaks down a little bit later in digestion with their dual capsule technology. So anyhow, that link is down below for 30% off with Seed. Before I get into this actual study, let me lay some quick framework. I'm not going to go overhead too much on this. I just want to get the idea across. Okay, dopamine is something that we build a tolerance to. The simple theory is like the hard drugs, right? Hard drug is going to increase dopamine so much that then you need more and more and more of that drug. If you extrapolate that model out to like social media or pornography or these other things that people develop addictions to, it's not necessarily the same. I want to make sure that I'm scientifically accurate here because a lot of people will say it's the exact same, you're working the exact same pathway. These small little surges of pleasure that we get in dopamine are not necessarily acting the same way that like a major drug is going to activate. But it's still a huge part of it and something we need to acknowledge. There's two kinds of dopamine that we really want to pay attention to. There's what is called tonic dopamine and phasic dopamine. Tonic dopamine is dopamine that is already bound to the receptor, already in your body. Your level of pleasure already at baseline. Phasic dopamine is dopamine that comes in after reward. So to give you context, let's say you're already a pretty happy person, you have a high level of tonic dopamine, but then someone puts a beautiful cake in front of you and you start eating it, your phasic dopamine is going to increase. So you have dopamine that's already been bound and now you have free dopamine that's coming in. It's a very simple way of putting it. So now that we understand this, let's talk about this study. So this study puts subjects in a metabolic ward. It is as rigorous as you can get with a study like this. Okay, 14 days times 2. It was a crossover. So they had one group do one thing, another group do another thing, and then they crossed over. What they did is they had them go into these metabolic wards and do 5 days of a eucaloric diet where they just ate at baseline. Okay? And then it divided them into two groups, a low-fat group and a low-carb group. Both groups eating at 30% deficits. So they were eating at the same metabolic rate, same deficit. One was low-carb, one was low-fat. Then after that, they had them do 3 days of ad libitum eating. This means they could just eat however much they wanted to of whatever they wanted to. During this study, they plugged them into what is called a functional MRI. The difference between an fMRI and an MRI is a functional MRI can show where the blood is flowing, especially when you use like radioisotopic tracers to look at like D2 receptors. And that's exactly what they did. And then they showed them pictures of food, and they wanted to see how this was affecting dopamine, and it's pretty earth-shattering. They found that the low-carb people had no effect on their reward circuit when they showed them a picture. They were in a caloric deficit, arguably hungry, but they showed them a picture of food and it did nothing to their dopamine receptors. But in the low-fat group, it seemed to decrease the activity of the reward receptor. That sounds bad on the surface, right? Sounds like, well, didn't you want to increase satisfaction, increase reward? No, it decreased the activity, which means that they were in a dopamine deficit, wanting more. Okay, so if you have something lighting up dopamine, like that's good, but when you have sort of a deficit in this category, it means that they're still looking for more. But then it goes beyond this. They found that the low-fat group had increases in tonic dopamine. What does this mean? What does this tonic dopamine? I mean, I talked about it earlier, but what does an increase in tonic dopamine mean? An increase in tonic dopamine means that even when they were in a caloric deficit and they showed them pictures of food, the low-carb group ended up having more of their dopamine sites activated by tonic dopamine, which means that they would need even more stimulation to finally get pleasure, because their dopamine receptors are so saturated with tonic dopamine, existing dopamine, that in order to feel and feel more, they would actually need even more. So imagine like a stepladder approach. You get a rush, you elevate to that rush. You need more, you elevate to that rush. That tonic dopamine is their level of elevation to that rush. Okay, this did not happen with the low-carb group. And then when they finally went into the ad libitum portion where they could eat whatever they wanted to, the low-fat group ate significantly more junk. They ate high-carb and high-fat foods because they felt like they needed it. The low-carb group did not. What's interesting is that the calories were reduced to the same amount, but one group was craving so much more. The calories were reduced the same amount, yet one group was getting just excited about pictures of food, and the other group didn't care, even though they were in the same deficit. So what's happening metabolically in our body is different than what's happening up here, and it starts up here. And here's an interesting fact. When you look at leptin, which is a satiety hormone, leptin, when elevated, should in theory make you less hungry. But we found something out. We found out that leptin inhibits dopamine. Okay, so when leptin binds to your brain, it'll actually slow the release of dopamine. This is actually kind of good because it makes it so that you're not having chronically, like just these big spikes, right? But what happens in people that are very overweight? They become leptin resistant. So they produce leptin, but it doesn't actually bind to the receptor site in the brain, meaning they're not getting an inhibitory effect on dopamine. So they still remain very, very at mercy of these dopamine spikes, which is why people that are very overweight tend to still crave food even more and more and more. So the answer is not to just restrict your fats. More likely, if you are someone that is dealing with a food addiction issue, lowering your carbohydrate intake might be a better solution based on what we've seen with functional MRI. I'll see you tomorrow.